Our next presenter, and you can all stand up while she comes up to get her technology, get a little more coffee, do what you need to do. Asavari.
You can try.
You want me to try? Thatte. No, okay, so tell me. Thatte. Asavari Thatte. Come on up.
I never thought I would say I want to go to school. Definitely not after my kindergarten teacher hit me for not knowing the word owl, or after my second grade teacher made the whole class stand for an entire day and hit each little outstretched palm with 2 rulers. There were days when school was okay, but I don't remember it being a lot of fun. I don't remember that I ever laughed until tears ran down my eyes, or if I played and ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore, or if I was so excited about something at school that I couldn't keep still. I think going to that school felt like walking through a long, never-ending corridor. Coincidentally, the school did have long corridors. During monsoon, when the days would be dark and gloomy, the corridors became even darker. The dark corridors, however, appealed to my sense of adventure. And surprisingly, they did serve a great purpose later in life when I read the Harry Potter books. Even before the movies were made, I had a dark and mysterious movie set ready for the production of the movies in my head. Pardon my digression. Let me go back to the corridors as the metaphor for my own schooling experience. My experience of the school seemed dark, monotonous, and never-ending like the corridors. The light at the end of the corridor in the school was a boring classroom with rows and rows of desks. However, unlike the school corridor, the metaphorical corridor of my schooling experience met with a better fate than a classroom. The light at the end of my schooling experience corridor was a place called the learning home. The learning home was a place that was just too much fun to be called a school. It was a place where teachers seemed to know you. They even seemed to care about you. The learning home was a place where it was okay to laugh. And strangely, it was also okay to be wrong. I saw the light at the end of my corridor, and that was when I said, I want to go to school. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity that I've been given to present my research at GRAE. My name is Asavari Thatte. I'm a 4th-year PhD student in the art education program at Penn State, and the title of my dissertation is Gram Mangal, an ethnographic case study of collective lived experiences, curriculum, and the processes of designing instructional resources. The story I just narrated serves 2 purposes. It helps me give you, my audience, a sense of what my schooling experience was like, and which was also possibly the experience of many other students in India. The story also acts as a sample of a blended narrative writing style, which is one of the methods I use to represent my data. I will talk about that later in my presentation. So as you must have figured out from my story, I had a very dissatisfactory experience of schooling in India. I realized as I was working on my research that most of my schooling experiences were already a part of the literature on contemporary mainstream education in India. So the mainstream education in India is characterized by rote memorization, authoritarian teachers, excessive importance on examinations, hierarchical structures, children and their needs being treated as last priority, curriculum that is standardized, and classrooms that are crammed. My personal, practical, and intellectual goals that motivate me and drive my research are seeking alternatives to mainstream education in India, examining pedagogical spaces where children are a priority, studying spaces where teachers and educators practice creative freedoms, examining the lived experiences of individuals in alternative educational spaces, and searching for ways in which design enriches the lives of children. So while I was pursuing my bachelor's degree and master's degree in design, and later when I worked in the area of design, I realized that I was always drawn to designing for children, and that's the interest and passion that continues even now in this research. So my experiences of schooling in India and my background in design have played a huge role in shaping my research goals and research interests. In 2014, I began my search for a site where I could carry out my research, and I worked with 6 nonprofit organizations working in the area of education in India. And these are the logos of 6 of these organizations. The one in the center is Gram Mangal. So one of the 6 sites that I visited was a nonprofit called the Gram Mangal. Gram Mangal's site that I visited in 2014 was a school called the Learning Home in the city of Pune, about 3.5 hours away from Mumbai. This is a school for urban children from middle to higher middle income families. From amongst these 6 nonprofits, Gram Mangal's educational philosophy and practice aligned most closely with my educational philosophy and research interests. Influence of Dewey are clearly visible in my conceptualization of education. I believe the purpose of education is not to build a repository of information, but to help the child or the learner to learn ways of thinking. So the aim of education and learning is to create a variety of educational, educative learning experiences that create a variety of thinking processes. So here are some of the observations that I made during my pilot studies at the Learning Home. The Learning Home is a space between school and home. So what they attempt to do is provide home-like atmosphere in the school context. So here while I was reading Nell Noddings, I kept thinking back to my experience at the Learning Home, where the care is so palpable in the relationships that play out in this particular space. Physically, the space is open and the environment is free. So the first picture that was on the first slide, that was the Learning Home. It's not an imposing concrete school structure, but the classrooms are free and open. Children have the complete freedom for mobility to move around from one classroom to the other. And you can see the first picture and the third picture. While I was there, the kids wanted to show me everything, all the tricks that they could. And while they did that, I realized that they had a very close relationship with their physical environment. This girl on top is trying to climb 2 trees at the same time. There are trees inside the school and outside. And almost every kid who's maybe older than 6 years can climb a tree. So the picture in the center is kids who are working with a person who had come from outside and was working with them to build a biogas plant. So that just is an example of how the curriculum is not really focused on bringing in school subjects that are mandated by the government and putting them into practice in schools. It's about giving the kids experiences that are relevant to life and learning. And so the pedagogical approaches are constructivism-based, and the founder of the organization and the educators work heavily into really understanding theory and bringing it into practice. Again, project-based and experiential learning is a part of the education at the Learning Home. While I was there working on the pilot studies, I helped them out a little bit with design. So that's the good and the bad thing with people knowing that you're a designer. You get asked to do some free stuff or a little bit of work for them. Anyways, so it turned out to be a good opportunity, because while I was working with them, I realized that a lot of instructional resources are designed within the organization for the purposes of educating their children. And so that moment was a eureka moment, and I thought, yes, I assumed, or I was excited that the educators might be following a design process or a design thinking process in the creation of instructional resources. But there's a but that follows, because however, as my research evolved, I was forced to challenge my own conceptualization of what entails a design process, and I will talk about that later. So let me give you a very broad overview of the differences in the mainstream education system and the Learning Home. So at the Learning Home, the emphasis is on the child's, whether or not the child understands the concept. Evaluation is based on learning, and there isn't an overemphasis on examinations. Rather, there's no emphasis on exams and testing. There are close family-like relationships amongst teachers, amongst students, amongst teachers and students. Relationships are democratic, not hierarchical. Education is child-centered. Children are a high priority. Curriculum responds to the needs and the context of the children, and there's an open environment in close proximity of nature. Let me share my research statement with you. The aim of my study is to examine the curriculum and the collective lived experiences of the individuals associated with Gram Mangal's learning home, a constructivist school in India, and the design processes that emerge from and influence this context. So on this slide, I have mapped my questions on the landscape of my conceptual framework map. Question 1, as you can see, is situated right in the center of the focus of my study, which is curriculum and the lived experiences at Gram Mangal. Question 2 slightly moves away from the center towards the design processes that are playing out at Gram Mangal. Question 3 is specifically concerned with the design processes. Question 4 is a more implications-based question and kind of moves away from this central concept. So the first question is, what are the collective lived experiences that inform and emerge from Gram Mangal's philosophy and curriculum? Question 2 is, how do the lived experiences of educators inform the design of the Gram Mangal curriculum? Question 3 is, what are the processes used by educators to design instructional resources at Gram Mangal? And finally, the fourth question is, how does place inform lived experiences and curriculum and the development, design, and implementation of instructional resources? So while I worked on a design project with the educators during my pilot study, I realized that the instructional resources were being designed in a way that aligned with constructivism-based pedagogical practices. I'm interested in understanding this overlap between constructivist education and instructional design. So to reiterate, the design of the instructional resources at Gram Mangal is heavily influenced by constructivist education, and that's what I'm interested in finding out. So the design processes, I'm sorry. So the primary focus of the study is understanding the curriculum and the lived experiences of the individuals at the learning home. Gram Mangal's educational philosophies, theories, and practice are heavily influenced by constructivism and hence inform the curriculum and lived experiences of the individuals associated. So in my mind's eye, I see an overlap between with lived experiences curriculum and constructivist education. Please know that the maps are not to scale. Constructivist education is huge, where right now you see it here. Designers have some limitations too. So this was the slide that I already explained with the overlap between instructional design and constructivist education. So the design processes that happen at the intersection of constructivist education and instructional design are happening in the very specific context of the curriculum that is planned and lived at Gram Mangal and the lived experiences of the individuals there. Moving on to my conceptual framework, these are some of the key constructs and theorists whose work helps me shape and ground my study theoretically. So here the key constructs that really help me shape my research are curriculum, lived experiences or collective lived experiences, constructivism, and instructional design. So I'll first talk about curriculum. Aoki, Noddings, Tagore, and Pienaar influence my conceptualization of curriculum. So curriculum is not just an intended plan, but an integrated approach to the theory and practice aspects of curriculum and instruction. Aoki's concepts of planned and lived curriculum are critical to my conceptual framework, especially due to the constructivist nature of the learning home. Aoki's idea of praxis, which is a result of the teachers traversing between theory and practice, is relevant to my research since theories of learning are studied and implemented at the learning home and Gram Mangal. So at the learning home, teachers are engaged in living the theory. They live the theory by the need of having to bring it into practice. Their living of the theories is not prescribed since the theoretical orientation of the organization believes in the possibilities of multiple lived curricula, as Aoki would call it. The theories are embodied by the teachers, and by embodying the theories, they're made their own. They're made personal. This is where their own lived experiences inside the learning home and outside come into play as they blend their own lived experiences with the organization's theories and make them their own. I would say then that in a place like the learning home, which is rich with the possibilities of freedom, there are possibilities for multiplicity of theories to emerge as each teacher and educator, in embodying the theories, make them their own, giving rise to multiplicity of curricula, and theories of curriculum. So from Noddings, Tagore, and Dewey, I borrow a framework for curriculum where the learner is at the heart of the curriculum design, development, and implementation endeavor. I move on to talk about lived experiences. By lived experiences, I refer to the experiences of an individual encounters in the process of living, and by extension, in the process of learning as well. Conforming to Dewey's principle of continuity of experience, every experience lives on in further experience. By collective lived experience, I wish to imply the common or similar lived experiences that the individuals associated with Gram Mangal share with each other and with the organization. So the question I'm trying to ask here is, what kinds of experiences do these individuals have apart from and as a result of being a part of this organization? So the third term, that's constructivism, I use that to imply at least three kinds of constructivisms. One is epistemological constructivism, constructivism as a learning theory, and constructivism-based pedagogical practices. So this is a visualization of my attempt to map the landscape of curriculum, lived experiences, and design in relationship with some other constructs that influence and inform my conceptual framework. And this map is a work in progress, and I think it'll keep moving and shifting right until I'm done writing my dissertation. So moving on to the research design, my research study was an ethnographic case study. The research site was Gram Mangal's learning home in Pune. The research participants were teachers, educators, students, and founders at this organization. My positionality was that of an observer, and the duration of the study was from January to March 2015, 2 months. So I find it really necessary here to talk about the distinction between the educators and the teachers. The teachers were individuals employed by the organization to teach the content. The educators had a much broader role. So the educators were responsible for carrying out a number of responsibilities. For example, they were trainers to other teachers in other organizations. They provided consultancy services, and at the same time, they were also present in classrooms. So here's an overlap between the teachers and educators. And in the classrooms, they developed a lot of the instructional resources that are used at Gram Mangal. So data collection methods. I have 26 hours of interviews that are gathered in Marathi, which happens to be the medium of instruction in the school, and which also happens to be my native language, my mother tongue. I carried out observations for 2 months. I was there every day for about 6 to 8 hours during school. I documented, I have about 15 Gram Mangal publications that have been translated from Marathi into English. And I have 6 instructional resources I use as artifacts, and I have interviews associated with those instructional resources. So I'm going to run through this really fast because I've 4 minutes. There are 2 kinds of ways I'm analyzing my data. One is looking for similarities and differences in the coding, and one is looking for contiguity and relationships. I analyze my data in 3 stages. The first stage is when I transcribe, summarize, and interpret my data. Here's an example. So the first column is verbatim transcription of my data. Second is where I've summarized, reorganized data, and then the third column is where I've interpreted my data. Once that is done, I pull it into a software like in Vivo, where I actually code my actual transcription. And that just helps me see and look at my data differently by reorganizing and managing my data. And the third stage is looking for relationships, and I'm yet to get to that. So the limitations of this research, one, that this research was bilingual research. I had to spend a lot of time researching and talking to people who have done bilingual research to figure out what do I do when my data is in one language and I'll be writing about it in another language. I have a very interesting process, which I would love to share, but I can talk about it if anyone has questions, because there's so much more I need to still share. And the second concern was time constraints. I had only 2 months to be in India as I collected my data. So how do I ensure that I have everything I want before I come back? So I think I took care of this, and I think I did, by planning really into as much detail as I can before I went to India. Having all my questions ready, having talked to people a lot beforehand, preparing them, preparing myself. And I've continued to maintain the relationships with them, so if in future I feel that I really need to go back and talk to them, I can always do that. So I don't know if you're familiar, there's a app called WhatsApp that I use regularly to keep in touch with them. So to address validity concerns, I will use triangulation, member checks, and bracketing. Again, I can talk about it in detail should anyone have questions. Okay, so for data representation, I will be using two methods. The first is the blended narrative writing style. So the story that I read out in the beginning was a composite narrative that was created by blending my own personal experiences with the experiences of my research participants. So this method of representation will be used to present my data on curriculum and lived experiences. So the red shape that you've been seeing, that will be represented using this methodology. And I will be using design processes and their relationship with context by showing different diagrams and maps, and so that will be the visual representation aspect of my data. So findings are directed towards understanding the collective lived experiences and curriculum, relationships between collective lived experiences, curriculum, and design processes, So here is where I have a follow-up, as I said in the beginning that my process evolved. So as I previously mentioned, I had a very sterile, regimented, and standardized view of design and design processes. But as my study evolved, I realized that I was looking at design processes not as standardized set of steps or actions carried out with the intent of creating something preconceived, but rather actions that are carried out in response to the specific needs of specific situations. So the implication is that these processes are context-specific and so may or may not be generalizable. So the implications of my study for art education are advocating for the creative freedom of teachers and educators in developing their own instructional resources and pedagogical strategies. Implications for education are examining the intersection of constructivism and instructional design, again, in a specific context, not to be generalized. Implications for curriculum are advocating for context-specific development of curriculum and instructional resources. Implications for design are understanding the role that is played by the context in which design processes are embedded. And with that, I end my talk. Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask just a couple of informational questions about the school itself. So you said is it a public school?
No, so the Gram Mangal, the parent organization, is a nonprofit, and it has incredible history. It was started. It actually carries forward the legacy of two educators who worked in 1950s in tribal regions of the state of Maharashtra, where Mumbai is situated. And what they did, their work is extremely commendable because they took Montessori's methods, completely contextualized them to the cultural context of these tribal children, and then presented those to them and used it for their education. So the founder, who's still in his 70s and working with the organization, with Gram Mangal, started it in association with one of the educators. So Gram Mangal is has that historical legacy. And they work in very different socioeconomic, geographical, and demographic contexts. This school is a middle-class urban school, but they have schools, again, in tribal regions, and they also have schools for really poor, lower income kids in semi-urban areas.
So they're private schools more than public?
Yes, they're not part of the public school structure at all.
Right.
It's a little complicated in the sense that they tried to stay away from the standardized tests and said we won't conform to the curriculum, and because we want to teach it our way.
Right.
But it's the parental pressure that makes them give in and say that, okay, the 10th grade exam is sort of the state exam. So they have to make some changes and say, well, we'll let our students give the exam. So
okay. Yeah, that was kind of one of my questions.
Okay.
Was about the evaluation of this learning style, like how comfortable people in a situation where testing is everything on
Right.
some levels. How comfortable are they with what kind of evaluations and assessment you can do with this?
That is a great question, and that's a constant struggle for the organization. Because parents, in the beginning, they think, oh, this is a great concept. The kid will actually discover themselves in the surroundings. And then I think it's after 8th grade that they start freaking out, and they're like, they need to get so many, in India it's called marks, they need to get so many marks, so many % of marks to get into an engineering college. So that's where they start pulling them out of school, which is the unfortunate part.
Yeah.
I had two questions, and I don't think they're related, but the first one, you talked a lot about collective lived experience at the school, and this is, I guess, another just like, I'm curious how it works. Like, so what is a day like for the students? Are they, is it like a residency school, or are they in residence there with the teachers or in educators, or do they come? I mean, I'm just kind of curious about that.
Okay, so in the tribal schools, they have a residency program. I visited the other locations of Gram Mangal just because my fourth question kind of moves away from the learning home. So the learning home is the primary site for my research. The secondary sites were some of these other schools. So some of these other schools have residential programs where the kids stay in the school itself, but at the learning home, it's not a residential program. They come to school at 9 o'clock and leave at 3:30. So the day is, they come in, it's a very liberal democratic political ideology that's guiding the school. So there's no mention of religion or gods, which is unusual in India. But so it's a very secular sort of an approach to prayers, meditation. Then they start the school. They have periods like other schools would, but the approach to teaching is what's really different. If the kid says that, if the teacher comes to the class and is going to teach them about a tree, and the kids say, we are not in the mood, she'll say, why don't we go out and play? And in the process of playing outside, she'll teach them about the tree. So that's just to show you how the pedagogical methods are different, although they have the structure of maybe a school, somewhat.
Thanks. And this, I'm just curious, just because you kind of lit up when you talked about bilingual research and the translation issues, and I would be curious to hear you talk more about that, but I think specifically what I'm interested in is, since you're going from, like, I think you refer to it as your mother tongue to
Yes.
English, are there any benefits that you see from like having gone through this? Has it forced you to think about anything differently that you wouldn't, than maybe you would have in your mother tongue, I guess? Does that make sense?
I think I got the first half of it.
Like, I'm curious, I guess I'm just curious, like when you're forced to translate something into a language that isn't the one that you're the most comfortable.
So here's the funny part about it. The first language I learned was Marathi because that's the language we speak at home. But I went to an English medium school. So from the age of 3 or 4, I was learning to read and write English. So what's strange is that I take forever to read Marathi and write in Marathi, but I could read English in my sleep. And if I have to process information, it's processed in English in my head because I grew up thinking primarily in English. But Marathi being the language I speak at home, I'm so fluent speaking Marathi. So the process was that I would listen to my tapes in Marathi, and parallelly, I would be translating in my head and transcribing in English. So yeah, it sounds maybe funny, but yeah, that's how it works.
That's interesting.
That's really interesting.
I wanted to make one comment that kind of, that I was thinking about as you were talking. I was thinking about how Tim kept talking about this idea of art is life. And it's so interesting because I feel like when you're talking about this learning home, you're talking about the same kind of thing with learning. You're talking about learning that's kind of embedded within life. So I think it's, and the space for failure, which I think was an interesting kind of connection too that you made. It's okay to laugh, it's okay to be wrong, that it has a different feel about it being your life and not what you just come and do for 8 hours.
Absolutely, absolutely. And which is why they call it lifelong learning, even the organization. So one of the amazing things about the organization is that they're really grounded in theory. When they're not just practicing it because, it's nice to have an open concept education, and so let's do it. They've really studied their theories before they bring them into practice. And so they have study groups to do that. It's a very intense sort of an effort that they're involved in. And one of the things that they said that really stuck with me was they said, we're doing this for lifelong learning. And the children are learning processes. They're learning an affinity to knowledge that is going to stay with them, and they're going to carry it hopefully throughout the rest of their lives.
Well.
Hi.
Anybody else? So we talked about the bilingual thing, and I just kind of endlessly fascinated as a vehicle for thinking through, how does your experiences as in bilingual research possibly become a vehicle for understanding this idea of, you called it sort of like the local design processes in instructional resource development?
Yes.
Right? So is there an engine of thought there that might translate in terms of your own, terrain of research in this bilingual space that might aid in understanding that local design process? I'm wondering if those sort of entanglements have crossed in your thinking and in terms of how you're...
Just for me to make sure I'm understanding right, did I talk to you about the local processes separate from the presentation? Because there's something called the local processes which is a part of what I'm going to write. Or did you pick something
just picked that up from what you presented here. And again, we've talked a little bit more about your research in other contexts.
Okay.
But that connection for me came up today in terms of, are those, I'm really sort of fascinated with this idea of we think about instructional resources being designed, but having sort of a hyper focus on what are the local, really contextual processes that folks go through in designing those things to fit their really, their singular classroom. So something they're not anticipating to be for the school or for a district, or in this context, I'm not sure what the frameworks for the institutions would be. But that very localized kind of conception, I think, is really interesting. And I'm wondering if this idea of, I'm drawn to the idea of translation, right? And the ways that you talk about translation and make it so much more rich and kind of complex and interesting. I'm wondering if those are cross-pollinating at all.
Well,
you could just say no if they're not, but...
No, I have no idea. I'd need to give that more thought. But thank you so much for bringing up that point. But I can definitely speak to the first half of what you said, that there are in fact local, and they themselves, it's sort of like an emic category, because they themselves call them local design processes, because I went into the research thinking, there's one design process that I want to find that they use. And when I actually went there, I realized that there could be multiple kinds of processes that they're using, and I cannot fit them into this linear box of design processes. Starting off with, what's the problem? This is the problem. Let's do convergent thinking, divergent thinking, and then test out the prototype. That does happen. Not to say that it doesn't, but there are also local processes. And what that means is that due to this constructivist approach, when an educator enters a class, and if the kids decide they don't want to do something, they want to do something else, it's right then and there, within the next 5 minutes, that the educator will design something for them. And that's a very localized, short-lived, not permanent sort of a process. And I don't know if that, I will think about whether it translates.
It's really fascinating. I have one follow-up that's more practical in terms of, did you mention in terms of your validity would be member checks? You're going to use member checks?
Yes.
Okay, so then how are you going to navigate this bilingual entanglement with your member checks? And then I'll stop.
That's a perfect question, and I will talk to you about that later. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.